8. MV2 Osprey crashes. The MV2 Osprey was conceived during the 1990s as a replacement for the U.S. Marine Corps' aging CH-46 Sea Night helicopter fleet. Like a chopper, it's capable of vertical takeoff and landing, but it possesses the range and altitude of a turboprop airplane and can go twice as fast as a typical helicopter. Just to give you an idea, Navy SEALs flew an Osprey all the way from Nigeria to Spain after rescuing a hostage in 2021. Despite its achievements, the Osprey has been controversial since its first prototypes flew in 1989. In addition to costing exponentially more than its initial projected cost, many people have died flying the aircraft, including 30 service members who perished during its development between 1991 and 2006. The Osprey's safety record has improved significantly since it entered service in 2007, although deadly crashes have continued to happen. In 2022 alone, 9 Marines died in 2 different collisions. In some cases, human error was blamed. The aircraft is also prone to mechanical problems and has been grounded on more than one occasion. But the Osprey certainly isn't the deadliest aircraft the military has flown, and it's needed for its unique capabilities. In 2023, the military announced that it was done buying Ospreys, but plans to continue using the 400 that are currently in service. 7. Operation August Storm. The U.S. bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, failed to corner the Japanese into surrendering to the Allies. 2 days later, and 1 day before the bombing of Nagasaki, the Soviet Red Army declared war on Japan. In a 3-pronged attack, more than 1.5 million Russian soldiers invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria in northeastern China. The Soviets also conducted amphibious landings. The Japanese didn't see the ambush coming. In fact, Emperor Hirohito had recently asked Stalin to mediate between Japan and the US. To suddenly be attacked by the Soviets constituted a huge betrayal in the eyes of the Japanese, and would be a major factor in their eventual decision to surrender. The Japanese fought back fiercely against the Red Army, but were ultimately no match for the numerous, well-organized, and better-equipped Russians. The fighting continued for nearly a week, including after the Americans dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. By then, Emperor Hirohito was practically begging his cabinet to agree to surrender. On August 15th, the Japanese unconditionally surrendered to the Allies. Today, the West, especially the United States, almost entirely credits the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with winning the war against Japan. But the Soviet invasion of Manchuria played a critical and widely overlooked role in ending the conflict, and it was one of the largest and most successful Red Army military operations of all time. 6. Operation Nifty Package. For much of his rule over Panama from 1983 to 1989, dictator Manuel Noriega was a U.S. ally. Relations soured after American officials learned that Noriega was involved in drug trafficking and sharing U.S. intelligence with Cuba. After unsuccessfully urging him to resign for more than a year and a half, American forces invaded the country in a mission codenamed Just Cause. Their first objective, known as Operation Nifty Package, was to capture Noriega, who took refuge at the Vatican's embassy, the Apostolic Nunciature. Storming the embassy would have violated international diplomatic law, so soldiers surrounded the property and urged the Vatican to give Noriega up. The Holy See rejected the request, so the Americans encircled the building with large speakers and blasted music at full volume, hoping to force Noriega out by essentially driving him crazy. They played songs by Van Halen, Tom Petty, AC/DC, Guns N' Roses, Jethro Tull, and other rock and roll musicians. To make the situation even more maddening, the soldiers also revved vehicle engines and used a nearby field as a helicopter landing pad. Noriega stayed put, but the music was quite bothersome to Monsignor Jose Sebastian Laboa Gallego, who complained to President George H.W. Bush about the noise. After 3 days of non-stop tunes, the military stopped playing the music. Meanwhile, Monsignor Laboa began trying to convince Noriega to surrender. At one point, he told Noriega that no country in the world was willing to grant him asylum, and that he had no choice but to turn himself over to the Americans. Laboa also threatened to relocate the embassy and abandon Noriega. Finally, after 10 days, the deposed dictator exited the embassy and was taken into custody without incident by U.S. paratroopers. 5. The Raid at Cabanatan. In what became known as the Great Raid of World War II, U.S. Army Rangers, Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas crossed enemy lines into Japanese territory near the Philippine city of Cabanatan on the night of January 28, 1945. They marched 30 miles, 48.3 kilometers, toward the notorious Pangasinan Camp, where hundreds of American POWs and civilian prisoners were being held. There was little time to observe and no time to rehearse, leaving the Allied troops with no choice but to get it right the first time. Posing as villagers, the Alamo Scouts served as advance reconnaissance and surveillance teams. As the Rangers waited for nightfall, an American fighter pilot distracted Japanese guards with a loud and erratic aerobatics display. They cut the camp's phone lines and launched a coordinated ambush under the cover of darkness, overwhelming the Japanese with speed and firepower. Meanwhile, guerrilla forces positioned themselves on the main road to prevent Japanese reinforcements from reaching the site. Traumatized from being held captive for nearly 3 years, POWs were initially suspicious of the forces who came to rescue them. They also didn't recognize the Army Rangers' uniforms. In some cases, U.S. soldiers had to remove prisoners by force. The POWs were so emaciated and sickly that many of the Americans carried 2 of them to safety at the same time. In just a half hour, the mission was accomplished, and 500 former prisoners were now free. Allied casualties were minimal, with 2 U.S. soldiers and 9 Filipino guerrillas killed, 4 men wounded, and 2 prisoners of war dying in the raid. Japanese casualties numbered in the hundreds. To this day, the raid at the Cabanatan remains one of the most successful hostage rescue missions in U.S. military history. 4. Operation Thunderbolt. On June 27, 1976, Air France Flight 139 departed Tel Aviv, Israel for Paris, France, with 246 mostly Jewish and Israeli passengers aboard. During a stopover in Athens, 58 more passengers boarded the plane, including German terrorists Wilfried Bose and Brigitte Kuhlmann, as well as 2 members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PLO. 8 minutes after taking off from Athens, the 4 extremists stormed the cockpit with guns and forced the captain to change route and fly to Benghazi, Libya. 7 hours later, after refueling, the hijackers forced the pilot to fly to Entebbe Airport in Uganda, where at least 4 other terrorists joined them. They forced the passengers off the plane and held them prisoner for days in a disused airport terminal. The hijackers demanded a $5 million ransom and the release of 53 Palestinian and pro-Palestinian militants in exchange for the release of the airplane hostages. If their demands weren't met within 3 days, they would begin to execute the captives. Meanwhile, they separated Israeli nationals and Jewish captives from the rest of the passengers and questioned them. 48 non-Israeli hostages, mostly elderly individuals and mothers with young children, were released the following day. A few days later, the captors extended the ransom deadline and released 100 more non-Israeli prisoners. After negotiations for the remaining captives' release failed, the Israeli Defense Forces resorted to Plan B. Under the cover of darkness, elite commandos flew 4 planes to Entebbe to carry out a harrowing rescue mission, known as Operation Thunderbolt, Operation Entebbe, or Operation Jonathan. The plane carrying the assault team landed first. Commandos exited the aircraft in Land Rovers and drove toward the terminal, where they stormed the scene. 3 more IDF planes landed at the airport and unloaded armored personnel carriers filled with soldiers who were tasked with maintaining security, gathering intelligence, and destroying Ugandan military planes. 2 hostages died after being mistaken for hijackers, and another was fatally shot in the exchange of gunfire between the IDF and the captors. All 8 suspects were killed during the shootout. While the operation didn't go perfectly, it was over in just 6 minutes. The IDF teams loaded the hostages onto the planes while under fire from Ugandan forces. including gunmen who shot at them from the air control tower. Unit Commander Yonatan Netanyahu was killed, at least 5 commandos were injured, and 10 hostages were wounded. Some countries and leaders condemned Israel for the raid and classified it as an act of aggression, while others saw it as heroic and necessary for saving the lives of innocent civilians. Today, it's remembered as one of history's most iconic hostage rescue missions. During a remembrance ceremony in 2012, Uganda and Israel reaffirmed their commitment to fight terrorism and work towards humanity. 3. Maersk, Alabama rescue. In April 2009, 4 Somali pirates attacked and boarded the American-flagged cargo ship Maersk, Alabama. It was the first successful seizure of a U.S.-registered ship since the early 19th century. Chief Engineer Mike Perry ordered 14 other crew members into a fortified room designated for this exact kind of attack, while Captain Richard Phillips was taken hostage. Armed with a knife, Perry overpowered the pirates' ringleader, Abduwali Muse, tied him up, and took him to the secure room. He hoped to exchange Muse for the return of Captain Phillips, but the other pirates refused. Meanwhile, they forced Phillips into an enclosed lifeboat. The U.S. Navy destroyer USS Bainbridge and the guided missile frigate USS Halliburton responded to the scene and attempted to negotiate with the pirates. A 3-day standoff ensued as the Somalis stubbornly refused to give up Captain Phillips. It eventually became clear that the pirates were not going to work out an agreement with the Americans, and that Phillips' life was increasingly in danger. Under orders from then-President Barack Obama, Navy SEAL snipers from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, better known as Team 6, parachuted onto the Bainbridge. In an astonishing display of accuracy, they fatally shot the 3 pirates in the lifeboat through its windows with 0 harm to Phillips. Abduwali Muse, the only surviving pirate, was taken to the U.S. to face justice. He pleaded guilty to hijacking, kidnapping, and hostage-taking, and was sentenced to 33 years in federal prison. 2. Moscow Theater hostage crisis. Also known as the Nord-Ost siege, the Moscow Theater hostage crisis began on October 23, 2002, when 40 Chechen terrorists seized the Dubrovka Theater in Moscow in the middle of a live musical. Around 90 people managed to escape, while more than 800 were held hostage for nearly a week, as the captors demanded Russia's withdrawal from the disputed Republic of Chechnya. Armed with guns and explosives, the hostage-takers made it clear that they had no qualms taking their own lives for their cause, if they deemed it to be necessary. They repeatedly threatened to shoot and kill their captives, but thankfully never acted on it. It didn't make the situation any less terrifying or dehumanizing for the prisoners, who were kept in the auditorium and forced to use the orchestra pit as a bathroom. Realizing it was unlikely that they would come to an agreement with the suspects, Russian Special Forces soldiers surrounded the building and pumped an opioid-based gas into the theater. A gunfight ensued until the gas began to take effect, at which point Russian troops stormed the building, entering from the roof and all the entrances. Some of the hostage-takers were equipped with gas masks and respirators and continued to shoot at the soldiers. All the Chechen rebels were killed in the operation, according to Russian officials. In keeping with Russia's notorious reputation for secrecy, the exact death toll of the hostages is unclear, but it's believed that at least 130 civilians died. Many were hospitalized with serious medical ailments. Others were denied medical care because of their alleged Chechen-sounding names, and victims also reported their valuables disappearing. Russian officials denied that any of the victims' deaths were caused by the gas, and they blamed a single corrupt officer for the theft of people's belongings. Vladimir Putin was condemned for refusing to engage in peace talks and inflicting violence in Chechnya following the incident. Russian authorities' lack of transparency also sparked widespread criticism, especially as the number of confirmed deaths continued to climb, leading some to suspect that public officials were somehow involved in the act of terrorism. The unfortunate reality is that we may never know exactly what happened that day, or if the military response could have been carried out better. 1. The rescue of Scott O'Grady. While flying a NATO mission over northern Bosnia in 1995, at the height of the Bosnian War, U.S. Air Force Captain Scott O'Grady's fighter jet was shot down by Serbian rebels. He parachuted into hostile territory, where he hid just feet from Bosnian Serb forces and narrowly avoided their barrage of gunfire. Over the next several days, O'Grady used his radio sparingly to prevent unfriendly forces from picking up his transmissions. And to preserve battery power, he finally made radio contact on his 6th night, confirming for the first time to NATO forces that he was alive and hadn't been captured. 2 helicopters filled with Marines soon touched down near the location of O'Grady's radio signal. 20 Marines from the first helicopter set up a defensive perimeter, and 20 more were about to get off the second helicopter when O'Grady appeared. The aircraft were on the ground for no more than 7 minutes before taking off with the rescued airmen. On their way back to the U.S. naval ship USS Kearsarge, the choppers came under fire but managed to avoid any serious damage, and nobody was hurt. Thanks for watching. Which one of these military operations shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.